Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Hey, fix the money, fix the world. Stacy.
Yes, because if we fix the money, we wouldn't have many of the problems that we do in this fiat world, right? The fiat world right now is meeting. The leaders of the fiat world are meeting. They continue to meet yet for another week, I guess, at up in Scotland at COP26. And we're witnessing the failure of their consensus model. That's what we've seen for the past 20 years as they have annual meetings, huge sort of confabs, G8s, G20s, COP26, Paris climate agreements, all these sort of stuff. And nothing ever happens because of the incentive model built into the fiat system. So one of the solutions, of course, is we're going to electrify the world, right? We're going to move off carbon. We're decarbonizing the world. Well, let's look at this. To accomplish the energy transition, there is going to have to be a huge surge in production of key energy transition materials. Here is the chart, and the red line at the top on each of these charts is how much production is going to have to increase to meet the targets that these masters of the fiat universe have planned for us. And the first two, copper and nickel, but the bottom two in particular, especially troublesome, cobalt and lithium. As you see, total parabola there. So none of these batteries could be built without either cobalt or lithium. Cobalt, at least 50%, up to 70% of all cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's war-torn. There is child labor problem, huge humanitarian disaster, environmental disasters locally there. So the solutions aren't as pat and easy as you might think looking at the headlines and the pronouncements coming.
Right, fix the money, fix the world. So for years, we were told that the way to stimulate the economy was to print money. And then when it became obvious that printing money was actually causing economic decline and bank failure, they had to come up with a new narrative. And that was the green narrative, the ESG narrative, the COP annual gathering narrative. And as you're pointing out, you're just switching chairs on the Titanic. You're just going from one particular way to destroy the global economy using fiat money to a different way to destroy the global economy using fiat money. The incentive, according to this scheme, has to do with environmentalism versus growth. Both the narratives are just fig leaves to cover the truth that those in charge are just seeking to print more money for themselves because this particular money, fiat money, is controlled by a few people whom, and this is a direct quote from Warren Buffett, he said, yes, we print our own money, end quote.
Right. And to me, it just seems like an attempt to continue this status quo because they keep the fiat money system in place. They keep the intellectual property regimes in place. They keep the flow of capital in place and who is the boss, most importantly, in place. So when you look at this situation with the Democratic Republic of Congo, from which most of the world's cobalt comes, to me, it strikes me as a new form of imperialism, whereby we used to have the East India Company, or as it was known in the 1600s as the Honorable East India Company. We know for a fact it was just a tool of imperialism. It stole resources and it killed lots of people in the name of of maintaining their monopoly. Well, the same thing here is that environmentally friendly sort of thing. Is think about this, the resource curse that the DRC now has, and that is that okay, they have all this cobalt, but who owns the intellectual property to all the batteries that you could do it? So all they can do is sell the raw cobalt. They can't make their own batteries. They can't build their own economy. They can't have any plans with it because all the copyrights, all the patents, all the intellectual property on cobalt, converting it into a useful tool for this new green economy they're going to build is owned by these huge multinationals and is being struck, into international trade deals at the likes of these COP26. So you're like, basically their future is destined to be just a provider of cobalt while their supplies last.
Right, colonialism and slavery is alive and well by the green energy lobby. You mentioned the East India Company. It's also important historically because it's the beginning of the limited liability corporation, where companies could raise money in such a way where those who were investing in the activities had no liability. And that's something that's become metastasized over the centuries to the point where you have trillions of dollars being raised by people who, in this case, are raping and pillaging, I think is an appropriate term to describe what's happening in this country, for financial gain with zero responsibility. And when you remove responsibility from action, you have essentially a situation of lawlessness and a situation of extreme violence, right? And this is what was being perpetrated here. So this latest initiative, the Green Initiative, backed by fiat money, as long as it's backed by fiat money, it's backed by violence, because fiat money is backed by violence. As the New York Times has said, the dollar is backed by violence. Fiat money is backed by violence. Anything that's backed by fiat money is backed by violence. And this is just an extension of that violence perpetrated by the most violent.
Right. And that violence kind of erupts out of a fiat consensus. So whoever is the most powerful, has the biggest proof of stake, they get to set the rules in this fiat system. So whatever the US wants, the US will get from other nations, doesn't have to apply to itself. So they can demand Saudi Arabia pump more oil for our own domestic economy, and then force other nations not to have to do the same. With Bitcoin, we have consensus reached every 10 minutes, not once a year or once every few years at various international conferences at which they get to exclude major stakeholders. For example, China. China is over 25% of the world's carbon emissions, and yet it's not attending this. Why? Because of economic competition between it and the boss at this fiat conference. So the boss doesn't want them there. The boss is like, the emperor is angry with China for out-competing them on so many levels, and therefore they're not attending. So what sort of consensus is possible to be reached without one of the major stakeholders being there? Because of the censorship, essentially, the censorship of fiat system, whereby the biggest stakeholder could be the boss. You don't get that in Bitcoin. If one Satoshi, one little person, one poor person in El Salvador has as much power as the likes of Michael Saylor, who has tens of thousands of Bitcoin. So they have the same say in the operation, the consensus mechanism, the governance model of Bitcoin.
Right, and also with the fiat model, you need propaganda. And the propaganda tells the people living in the United States that they're the indispensable nation, that they have the moral high ground. This is propaganda to cover the fact that they're bullying other nations to commit environmental genocide.
Right. Well, I mean, that is what it is, and the answer is not necessarily any better than what came before it. And it's keeping in place the same power structure that has caused a lot of the environmental degradation and the world of chaos, the entropic world around us. So let's look at the incentive model of Bitcoin and what that has caused. And most importantly, I think this model of stranded energy, therefore stranded wealth around the world. And what I think that's a good way to look at it is like, we have stranded wealth. We don't need like a redistribution of fiat dollars that can be printed from a central authority in Washington, D.C. We need the basically stranded energy, stranded wealth captured around the world and enabled. And we see that with El Salvador, one of the poorest nations in the world. And look what's happening to them in terms of they don't need to meet to go decide like how to game the SDR system or the free tax system or stimulus system or all these sort of things. They just look at the incentive model of Bitcoin. Volcanoes are being harnessed to power Bitcoin mining in El Salvador in this new pilot project. The city of Berlin, 112 kilometers south of the capital city, San Salvador, has a geothermal plant that was built in 1999. The plant is composed of 16 2,000 to 3,000 deep shafts from which steam circulates and makes 3 turbines function. The energy generated by those turbines can reach up to 107 megawatts, but only 5 are used for the operation and mining of Bitcoin. The rest of the energy is used for the country's grid. So, you know, nobody wants to live out near a volcano. You don't build houses and industry out near a volcano in case it blows, right? And so Bitcoin is a great way to capture that energy and have a IMF World Bank free currency that you get to control and maintain your sovereignty as a nation and don't get to be bossed around.
Right, it's stranded wealth, is a good way to put it. So the Bitcoin network allows for countries and communities to plug into their stranded wealth source. It could be geothermal, it could be hydro, it could be solar, it could be various other renewable sources. A third of all the energy produced right now is completely wasted just in transmission of energy from point A to point B. And with Bitcoin, you can take the Bitcoin capturing mining equipment to the energy. So if you're out there off grid somewhere in Africa, you can actually just take your Bitcoin mining equipment, go to the hydro source of energy, wherever that may be, and convert it into Bitcoin, and you can then use as the hardest money ever in the history of humanity. So that again is capturing stranded wealth. And when you capture all this stranded wealth, what happens is wealth gets as decentralized as the protocol itself of Bitcoin, and it changes the very nature of wealth. It gets rid of the fiat money system. It gets rid of those who are ruling the fiat money system with their proof of stake in the fiat money system. And you have the peace, you have the ecological harmony, you have kind of a reunion with our spiritual selves, which is lacking since the Industrial Revolution ripped it out of everybody's soul. And we have a great mother and child reunion coming, to put it as maybe Paul Simon would write about it. And that's all being enabled by Bitcoin, and it's happening in El Salvador, the savior, as it's known in English. And the president is realizing that this is a way to bypass the IMF, whom he regularly mocks on Twitter.
I also want to point out, as we wrap up here, that as COP26 is meeting, what they're proposing is basically for the developing world not to build out energy infrastructure, not to develop, essentially, not to use as much energy as they did. So they call this in the article an eco-geopolitical innovation. And importantly, here we have Daniel Alvarez, president of the Rio Lempa Hydroelectric Executive Commission. He says, we are not reducing the energy supply of El Salvador. On the contrary, we are increasing it. And from the amount that we have increased, we have taken these 1.5 megawatts to start this first step with mining. So getting to increase their energy use and yet decrease their carbon footprint.
Right, it's a 51% on global energy, that is Bitcoin. We're going to take a break. When we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with Ben Aris. He's the editor of BNE.eu, business news from Eastern Europe, Eurasia, Middle East, Africa. Ben, welcome back.
Good to be here.
All righty, let's talk about a part of the world that is not getting a lot of attention on mainstream media, Uzbekistan. You've just returned from a week-long trip there. Tell us about what you saw on the ground in terms of their booming economy.
Yeah, it's all changed. I went there 25 years ago, shortly after independence, and the country had completely collapsed. This is an agricultural country, mainly dependent on cotton exports. And it was run by a virtual dictator, Islam Karimov, for the last 25 years. They've had one president since independence, who used to be the old Soviet boss. And 5 years ago, they brought in a new president, and he's opened the country up. He's launched a modernization effort. He liberalized the currency, started exports, made friends with his neighbors, and had been lobbying within the CIS, the former Soviet Union, and also to Europe, and to the Arab nations to the south, which are also interesting. And it's booming. It's absolutely booming. All these liberalizations have worked. And I went to a number of big companies in several different towns throughout the country. And everywhere I went, the story was the same. Like, now we can earn dollars, now we can do exports ourselves. We don't have to go through Tashkent, through the central government. And every company was investing in new production. They've either completed the first round or they're investing in second projects already. And diversification of the economy, because Central Asia is known as a home to hydrocarbons, and Uzbekistan doesn't have hydrocarbons. It doesn't have much. It's enough to feed itself. But its big advantage is this large population, 35 million people, and it's a young population growing really fast. It's going to overtake Poland and Germany in the next decade in terms of size. So you have this huge consumer market on top of everything else. And I went to a Hoover factory in the middle of the Kizilkum Desert, where they're now exporting to Ukraine, Kazakhstan, but they're also exporting to the EU. Samsung made under license, and they just opened the Nigerian and the Tanzanian market, where they're now going to export these things from the desert factory in the middle of nowhere in Uzbekistan. So it's really incredible to see. And having traveled a lot around the central former Soviet Union, I haven't seen such a rapid turnaround, such a rapid growth since the beginning of the noughties, where there was a petrol fueled boom in Russia. This is really astounding.
Is there much of a tourist industry, and what's the favorite dish of the Uzbekistanis?
Well, that's the other thing. This is the Silk Road. This is like, Alexander the Great was there, and the historic towns of Samarkand, Khiva, Bukhara, legendary places. The novel 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights story, that was written in Khiva in Uzbekistan. And the food is fantastic. I mean, when I go back to Europe and eat apples or tomatoes, and particularly melons, they taste of water. And here you have like the best produce you've ever had. And the classic, the favorite, the national dish is a thing called plov, which may be known as pilau to people in the West. But it's made from rice, yellow carrots, mutton, and cotton oil. And I know that sounds strange, but it's absolutely delicious.
All right. That's great. Let's meet up there next spring. Sounds good. Let's move back to global stuff here. The COP26 meeting. Neither China nor Russia are attending the climate change confab in Scotland. It seems that Cold War 2.0 is a failure of U.S. leadership over global institutions, ? What are your thoughts?
Well, Russia and China were there, just the presidents weren't there. But there's a lot of negotiating going on, because the problem with this, at BNE, the way we're looking at it is working out how much it's going to cost. And it's going to cost a lot. And people are reluctant to spend the money. And consequently, we're falling behind. I mean, the Paris Accords call for a 2-degree reduction, but the plans, as far as I understand them, and this is not widely reported, we're on course for a 5 to 6 degree increase with the pace it's going. And it's also become a geopolitical jousting match between the two sides, where Europe is going to impose this Green Deal and put these carbon duties on exports, and the Russians are desperately, who are heavily exposed to this because of all the raw materials they produce and all the gas they burn and coal, are trying to find a way around these duties in order to relieve them, because it's going to really hurt the Russian economy if they have to pay these charges. It's going to cost them billions of dollars.
Right. It seems like climate change is the new justification for more money printing. After decades of rationalizing money printing as a growth stimulus, that never happened. So they had to change the narrative. And now it's climate change to justify more money printing. A lot of countries around the world are cognizant of the role the U.S. dollar plays with U.S. dollar hegemony and the empire of debt, as it's called. The U.S. dollar, it's really their soft power way of ruling the globe. Some countries are opting out, like El Salvador, just made Bitcoin legal tender. And they openly mock the IMF on Twitter, essentially. Is any country like Uzbekistan, Russia, China, any country in the Middle East that you follow, are they going to smarten up and understand that Bitcoin is the way out of U.S. dollar hegemony? Already, I know you cover Africa. Already in Africa, it's exploding in Africa. Nigeria, Kenya, countries are becoming hyper-Bitcoinized. Where are we in the cycle in your backyard, what the countries that you cover, are they hip to the Bitcoin phenomenon yet, Ben?
Yeah, the theme of de-dollarization is a big one already. I mean, Russia's sold down a lot of its T-bills. It has very little exposure. And China and Russia are doing increasing amounts of trade with each other in their own national currencies. I mean, it was zero in 2008, and I think it's already a quarter, the one ruble trade. And Russia's added the Chinese one to the hard currency reserves it has. And they're trying to get rid of the dollar. I mean, they're even talking about launching an oil commodity exchange in St. Petersburg where you can buy and sell oil in rubles instead of dollars. But it's going slowly, although it is progressing. As far as Bitcoin, again, I think in Eastern Europe, they're being a lot more cautious. The Russian central bank is going to launch its version of a digital ruble, which is not quite the same as a cryptocurrency. And they're a bit nervous about it being unregulated because they're afraid of bubbles and people getting exposed to it and then losing all their money in the fluctuations. But having said all of that, I mean, they've embraced the whole electronic money revolution that's going on. And the Russians are on the leading edge in a lot of e-commerce and non-cash transactions. That we've got Russian companies now setting up e-grocery stores in London with ultra-fast delivery. And along with that comes with cashless payments and cryptocurrencies. It's not so far advanced, but I think in many ways the e-commerce in Russia is further ahead than it is in Europe. And so they're just waiting for the central bank to put in the groundwork.
Yeah, I heard that during the COVID lockdown, actually Russia fell in love with e-commerce and delivery type services. The Russians were very used to paying in cash, in person, and using credit cards and things like that were not natural for them. But the lockdown opened up this huge e-commerce market, and it's going like gangbusters. Is that true?
E-commerce is growing 5 times faster than the real economy. And you also have to realize that Russians, they love gadgets. Everybody's got a smartphone, everybody's online. And again, I think the penetration, again, is higher than in many. I mean, there's more people online in Russia than there are in all of Germany, which is the biggest, most populous country in Europe. And because of the distances as well. I mean, everybody needs digital. You can't run your business without being online. And so they've embraced it. And when they couldn't go out to shop, everybody just turned to the multiple e-commerce offerings that were already there. And the ultra-fast delivery, the companies had already introduced that service before the pandemic hit. So again, it was like this is like, what's the opposite of a perfect storm? I mean, it was a perfect stimulus for the business, which has just exploded and it's growing by leaps and bounds. It's going to be half of all retail within the next 25 years. And at the same time, you're having these big Russian e-commerce companies coming to market, and they've done a series of $1 billion, $2 billion IPOs in New York. Because again, the technology's there, the news is there, the know-how is there, and you've got 150 million people consumer market to base it on.
Yeah, with that boom in e-commerce comes a certain, let's call it a startup culture. The 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds around the world are taking the economy into their own hands, and they're decentralizing these economies with Bitcoin, and they're decentralizing it with apps. You know, when I visited Russia, I noticed, obviously, they're still mired in the old ways. It's a heavily bureaucracy, obviously. And but is that a spark for a green shoot, let's call it, of a new wave of entrepreneurialism that the country, I would say, desperately needs? But where are we on that cycle?
No, I think it's actually much further, much more advanced than you would assume. I mean, yes, the real economy is still bureaucratic and corrupt, but there's been this embrace of online business. I mean, Russia's richest woman is an e-commerce lady. She was a former teacher, set up a business with her husband not long ago, like 5-8 years ago, and now she's worth $1 billion. But it's also the institutions themselves have embraced it. I think the best example is Sberbank, which is the state savings bank. It's a retail giant. It has half of all deposits in Russia. But the boss of Sberbank, Gref, has been buying up e-commerce applications, and they've launched fintech. And they got to the point where he no longer sees the bank as a bank. to the point where they drop the word bank from their name. So it's just known as Spare. And it does everything. It does books, it does fintech, it does holidays, it does e-commerce, it does delivery. And what's going on at the moment is you've got about 4 or 5 rival big tech groups that are trying to build a whole ecosystem to run your whole life and provide you with the services, money management, pay your utilities, but deliver your food, book your hotel, hire and share your car. And they're snapping up these things, and these things are evolving very, very fast. I mean, the M&A has gone through the roof. So for young tech entrepreneurs, and Russia has a history of like highly qualified people, they're leaping into this, setting up companies and getting bought up.
All right, Ben Aris, thanks so much. Editor of BNE.eu. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thanks, very good to see you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. We want to thank our guest, Ben Aris. Until next time, bye, y'all.